The arena walls buckled as a black-winged, god-tier beast swallowed the noon sky. Thousands of elite tamers stared upward, too stunned to remember their cheers. At the center stood Ethan, once mocked for bonding a hatchling everyone called trash tier. Above him, 9 colossal tails burned with 9 different streams of power. One eye shone white like creation, the other reflected bottomless darkness. Across the ruined field, veteran god-tier tamers lowered their strongest companions. Nobody commanded them to bow, yet every beast lowered its head. 3 years earlier, Ethan could barely afford food for one tiny hatchling. Back then, teachers called his bonded beast defective, useless, and combat worthless. Even the girl he admired looked away after his humiliating awakening. Result: now, that same creature could stop an army with a single roar. And every major tamer faction in the world knew Ethan's name. Yet raw power was never the strangest part of their impossible rise. The real mystery was how an elementless beast kept rewriting its own evolution. It learned from fire, poison, frost, wind, shadow, and every battle survived. Every evolution changed its body, while every sacrifice deepened their bond. By the time the world understood Nyx, the truth threatened everyone watching, because the supposedly trash-tier beast had evolved into an entirely new species. This is today's story. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get into it. Starting with the bond awakening that changed Ethan forever. In Ethan's world, every person faced the bond awakening ceremony at 16. One successful bond could decide a family's wealth for several generations afterward. A powerful beast meant prestige, education, employment, and protection from dangerous zones. A weak beast usually meant debt, ridicule, and life outside the shining districts. Cities reflected that brutal hierarchy in steel, glass, light, and guarded walls. Legendary tamers lived above the clouds inside towers, glowing with permanent sunlight. Common rank families crowded the lower rings beside factories, markets, and polluted canals. Below them stretched forgotten neighborhoods where failed tamers survived through temporary work. Ethan Cole grew up in the lower district beside a collapsing transit line. His apartment had cracked windows, unreliable heating, and only one functioning light panel. He learned early that food mattered more than pride or fashionable tamer equipment. His mother had died when Ethan was 8 after a winter illness. His father disappeared 2 years later during an expedition beyond the Eastern Barrier. Officials reported his death, but no body ever returned to their home. That absence left Ethan with a photograph, several debts, and unanswered questions. The photograph showed his father smiling beside a massive silver armored beast. Teachers once called that man one of the city's most promising tamers. Then his final expedition was classified, and everyone stopped discussing his name. Ethan never believed the silence surrounding that mission was an ordinary accident. Still, survival left little time for mysteries surrounding his missing father's past. He worked evenings carrying feed sacks for a low-tier beast supply warehouse. Every coin he saved went toward registration fees for his own ceremony. For years, he imagined awakening beside something powerful enough to change everything. Maybe a flame lion, stormhawk, or armored serpent would answer him. Anything rare would secure academy offers and erase most of his household debt. Even a strong common beast could give him a respectable working license. Ethan never dreamed about becoming famous. He only wanted a stable future. The ceremony hall was packed with families wearing expensive coats and nervous smiles. Rows of crystal pillars surrounded a circular platform carved with ancient bond symbols. Students approached one by one while the crystals searched for compatible life signatures. Some bonds happened instantly, bursting across the hall like colorful fireworks. A wealthy boy received a crimson hawk whose feathers ignited without burning. The instructors announced rare rank potential, and his family exploded into celebration. Another student bonded with an epic rank stone ape, already taller than 3 adults. Recruiters immediately started recording offers before the ceremony even finished. Around them, Ethan watched every success while trying not to imagine his own result. Then Avery Bennett stepped beneath the brightest crystal in the chamber. A silver-blue fox appeared, surrounded by tiny arcs of living lightning. Its 9 narrow whiskers sparked whenever it breathed against the polished floor. The evaluators announced epic potential, and several professors began whispering at once. Avery accepted their attention with the calm confidence of someone expecting greatness. Ethan recognized her from regional rankings and quietly moved farther into line. Near the front stood Blake Sterling, heir to a powerful tamer corporation. He wore a white academy coat despite not officially entering Vanguard yet. People made space around him before anyone even knew his bonded beast. When Blake touched the crystal, every light inside the hall turned golden. A thunderous roar cracked several windows before the summoning circle fully opened. From burning radiance emerged a young solar lion covered in plated gold. The creature's paws left glowing marks across the stone without touching fire. One evaluator dropped his tablet after reading the bond classification twice. God-tier potential, the evaluator announced, his voice shaking through the silent chamber. Blake smiled like the entire city had simply confirmed what he expected. His father shook hands with recruiters before the applause completely settled down. Then Blake looked toward Ethan and noticed his worn shoes and patched coat. He asked whether the ceremony admitted charity cases now, loud enough for laughter. Ethan ignored him, because arguing with Blake could only make things worse. Finally, the crystal called Ethan's number, and the hall grew strangely quiet. He stepped onto the platform, carrying every hope he had protected for years. His palm touched cold crystal, and a weak gray pulse answered him. Nothing happened for several seconds, long enough for whispers to spread behind him. Then the summoning circle flickered once and released a puff of black mist. Something tiny rolled from the darkness and landed directly on Ethan's shoe. It was smaller than his fist, with charcoal fur and oversized silver eyes. Two soft ears folded backward, while a thin tail curled around its body. The creature sneezed, producing no flame, wind, lightning, or visible magical response. A scanner passed over it twice before displaying the same impossible result. Elemental affinity, none. Active skill, none. Species classification unknown. The evaluator frowned and requested a second scanner from another instructor nearby. Rank, unranked. Combat rating, negligible. Evolution path, unavailable. Someone in the audience laughed, and the sound spread across several rows. Blake laughed hardest, asking whether Ethan had bonded with the sewer mouse. Even instructors looked uncomfortable, because unknown species usually carried dangerous implications. But this creature showed no aggression, aura, resistance, or measurable elemental core. It simply stared at Ethan as though waiting for him to decide something. The lead instructor suggested releasing the bond before permanent synchronization completed fully. Ethan knew what that meant: reject the creature and remain bondless forever. Without a bonded beast, most academies would automatically reject his future applications. Still, keeping something worthless could trap him at the bottom just as permanently. The tiny hatchling trembled when several unfamiliar hands reached toward the platform. Ethan noticed its claws digging desperately into the fabric near his ankle. For 1 second, he remembered being alone after his father's disappearance. He remembered adults discussing him like another responsibility nobody wanted to claim. So Ethan bent down and lifted the creature into both hands. The hatchling stopped, trembling almost immediately against the warmth of his palms. Ethan told the evaluator he would keep the bond exactly as chosen. A few people laughed again, but Ethan no longer looked toward them. The ceremony registered Ethan at the lowest provisional combat grade available. By afternoon, 3 Academy scouts had withdrawn previously conditional interview invitations. His warehouse supervisor also reduced his hours after hearing about the useless bond. News traveled quickly when failure made a better story than ordinary success. Outside the hall, Blake waited beside his shining solar lion and friends. Blake asked whether a trash-tier bond deserved actual food or only garbage. The lion lowered its golden head, studying the hatchling with unusual concentration. For the first time that day, the tiny creature quietly growled back. Blake stopped smiling for half a second before ordering his beast away. Ethan noticed the reaction, but embarrassment kept him from thinking about it. Avery passed nearby and glanced once at the hatchling without saying anything. Her storm fox paused, sniffed the air, then pulled backward nervously. Avery frowned at that response, but Ethan had already turned toward home. Rain started before he reached the lower district and soaked his borrowed jacket. The hatchling remained hidden inside his coat, making soft clicking noises occasionally. Ethan spent his last coins buying nutrient paste approved for juvenile beasts. The shopkeeper warned him not to waste premium feed on an unranked animal. Ethan carried the packet home anyway, pretending the comment did not hurt. His apartment felt colder than usual when the door sealed behind him. He placed the hatchling on an old towel beside a chipped heating unit. The creature stared at the nutrient paste, sniffed it, then looked disappointed. Ethan laughed despite himself and mixed the paste with leftover chicken broth. That finally worked, and the hatchling ate with shocking enthusiasm for something tiny. It finished everything, it's the bowl, then climbed awkwardly into Ethan's lap. Only then did Ethan realize he had never decided what to call it. He tested several names, but the creature ignored every single one completely. When he whispered Nyx, the hatchling's silver eyes immediately focused on him. Ethan tried the name again, and its tail began tapping against his knee. For the first time since morning, Ethan felt something warmer than humiliation. He opened his academy application portal and found 3 fresh rejection notices waiting. Every message used polite language about limited placements and competitive evaluation standards. Ethan understood the real reason, because his bond classification appeared beside every application. Unranked companion, unknown species, no element, no registered combat skill. His carefully imagined future had collapsed in less than a single day. Ethan lowered the screen and finally let himself feel everything he had buried. He thought about his mother, his missing father, and the debts downstairs. He thought about Blake laughing while everyone else decided Ethan deserved the joke. His breathing broke, and tears slipped down before he could stop them. Nyx looked up from his lap and watched his face in silence. Then the hatchling climbed higher and licked one tear from his cheek. Ethan froze, because the gesture felt painfully gentle after such a brutal day. Nyx curled beneath his chin and released a tiny rumbling sound. Ethan held the creature closer, promising he would never abandon it for weakness. He did not know whether Nyx understood words, but the rumble deepened. That night, Ethan slept beside the heater with Nyx against his chest. Near midnight, a passing freight train rattled the apartment windows and pipes. Ethan never woke, but Nyx opened its silver eyes toward the darkness. Across the room, the old photograph of Ethan's father began vibrating faintly. A black symbol hidden beneath the frame glimmered for one silent second. Nyx stood, ears raised, staring directly at the strange mark. Then the symbol vanished before Ethan could ever notice its existence. Morning arrived with unpaid bills, cold rain, and another warehouse cancellation message. Ethan dressed for school anyway, refusing to hide after one terrible ceremony. He carried Nyx inside a padded sling because bonded juveniles required supervision. Students noticed immediately and restarted yesterday's jokes before first class began. One boy tossed a paper ball and asked whether Nyx could fetch trash. Nyx watched it roll, then deliberately turned its head the opposite direction. Ethan almost smiled, which somehow irritated the other students even more. During elemental theory, the instructor demonstrated flame projection using a training salamander. Nyx suddenly sat upright when the salamander released a controlled burst forward. Its silver pupils narrowed while the flame reflected across both dark eyes. Ethan felt a strange pulse travel through the soul bond between them. It vanished immediately, leaving behind a faint warmth beneath his sternum. He assumed stress had caused it, and returned attention to the lecture. But Nyx kept watching every elemental demonstration with impossible concentration afterward. Fire, wind, stone, water, lightning. Its eyes followed each attack carefully. At lunch, Ethan brought Nyx behind the gym to avoid another crowded room. A first-year student nearby practiced with a small ember lizard against targets. One poorly aimed flame bolt crossed the boundary and struck beside Ethan. Nyx jumped forward before Ethan could move, opening its tiny mouth instinctively. The flame bent sideways, compressed, and disappeared completely between its jaws. For 3 seconds, Nyx's silver eyes burned a deep and impossible red. Ethan forgot to breathe while the ember lizard started shrieking in panic. Then the red light vanished, leaving Nyx looking confused and perfectly unharmed. A translucent interface appeared inside Ethan's vision, visible only through their bond. The black display identified itself with 2 words: Void Interface. Void absorption acquired. Passive type. Compatible elemental energy can be integrated. Ethan stared at the message until his knees nearly gave way beneath him, because the supposedly worthless hatchling had just revealed a completely broken passive ability. More importantly, it proved Nyx was built different and capable of evolving. Ethan blinked repeatedly, but the void interface remained suspended before his eyes. Nobody else reacted, which meant the message existed only through his bond. He reached toward it, and his fingers passed through empty classroom air. Nyx sneezed again, releasing one tiny red spark from its nose. Ethan almost shouted before covering the hatchling beneath his jacket. Immediately, the ember lizard's owner demanded to know what happened to the flame. Ethan claimed the attack had dispersed against the safety barrier beside them. The student accepted the explanation reluctantly and returned toward the training field. Ethan carried Nyx home instead of attending the remaining afternoon classes. Ethan locked the apartment door and finally studied the void interface without interruption. Beneath Nyx's profile, one phrase changed everything. Provisional form, void hatchling. The panel confirmed absorbed flame could become permanent affinity if integration stabilized. Nyx had not blocked the Ember attack, it had rewritten itself with it. Ethan searched every public beast database he could access before dawn. Nothing matched an elementless hatchling capable of permanently integrating foreign elemental affinities. He checked research archives, illegal forums, and registries of extinct bloodlines. The answer stayed unchanged. Nyx had no recognized evolutionary branch anywhere. Nyx was not missing from classification. It had never belonged inside it. On paper, void absorption looked absurdly overpowered, and that made Ethan nervous. A broken passive would attract researchers, corporations, and tamers willing to steal. He tested one cheap flame crystal only after Nyx recovered completely. The crystal dimmed, but Nyx stopped feeding before the energy became unstable. Ethan noticed that restraint mattered more than raw absorption speed itself. Artificial fragments barely moved. Evolution progress, according to the void interface. So endless crystals could never brute force Nyx into a stronger form safely. Stable integration required compatible energy recovery time and Nyx's own acceptance. That last condition surprised Ethan because the interface treated choice biologically. He offered another warming stone, and Nyx simply turned its head away. The panel marked the material rejected instead of forcing absorption to continue. Ethan understood evolution would be something they negotiated, not something he imposed. Their secret would stay hidden until secrecy became more dangerous than disclosure. Their next problem was finding safe elemental residue without stealing registered resources. Ethan remembered the warehouse dumping grounds where damaged beast materials disappeared nightly. There was one more problem. Discarded materials carried unstable residue and hidden contamination. A careless feeding attempt could poison Nyx before evolution ever became possible. Ethan packed gloves, seal bags, and emergency suppressants before leaving the apartment. Nyx watched every preparation quietly, then climbed into Ethan's worn carrying jacket. Together, they headed for the disposal grounds before the night crews arrived. Broken cores, failed feed, damaged scales, and expired training stones accumulated there. Most carried only traces of power and were legally classified as waste. That afternoon, Ethan took Nyx through service tunnels toward the abandoned disposal district. People called the place the Beast Graveyard, though few actual corpses remained. Mountains of cracked armor plates and ruined equipment stretched beneath rusted cranes. Low-tier scavenger beasts wandered between piles, searching for edible magical residue. Many were abandoned companions whose tamers had released them after disappointing assessments. Ethan hated how quickly he understood the fear inside their cautious eyes. Nyx stepped from his sling and sniffed the air with sudden excitement. The void interface flashed several compatible elemental signatures around the nearest scrap mound. Ethan followed the strongest reading toward a shattered fire beetle shell nearby. A faint ember still glowed inside the cracked red carapace after months. Nyx touched its nose against the shell and absorbed the ember instantly. Red light pulsed beneath charcoal fur before disappearing into its chest. This time, the interface showed flame integration climbing by a visible amount. Ethan grinned so widely that Nyx started bouncing around his boots. For the first time, poverty had accidentally given them an advantage. Nobody valuable wanted these leftovers, making the graveyard almost completely unguarded. Ethan spent hours cataloging every usable fragment he could safely recover there. A windhare's broken horn gave Nyx a trace of air affinity. Discarded frost moss left silver-blue patterns moving briefly through its fur. A stone crawler shell caused its paws to become heavier for several minutes. Each absorption vanished physically, but something remained stored behind Nyx's strange core. Ethan stopped whenever the interface warned that elemental saturation approached unsafe levels. He refused to risk Nyx simply because faster growth seemed possible. That caution surprised Nyx, which protested whenever Ethan packed materials away early. The hatchling learned to fake exhaustion, then immediately searched Ethan's bag again. Ethan caught the trick on the third evening and laughed until coughing. Those quiet trips became the happiest part of both their lives together. At school, Ethan still endured jokes about bonding with the defective animal. After classes, Nyx learned another impossible piece of the world's elemental language. Ethan began recording every reaction inside an encrypted notebook on his tablet. Fire increased body temperature, while frost temporarily sharpened Nyx's night vision. Wind made its movements lighter, and stone strengthened claws for short periods. None produced reliable skills yet, but the accumulation pattern kept rising steadily. The void interface displayed something Ethan had never seen on commercial scanners. Evolution progress, 27%. Compatible branches recalculating from acquired affinities. Ethan stared at that number until the screen dimmed from inactivity. Evolution was not random for Nyx. The creature was actively building possibilities, and every elemental fragment apparently changed what those possibilities could become later. Ethan became more selective, choosing balanced traces instead of feeding everything available. He studied elemental interactions late at night before planning each graveyard trip. Nyx answered that effort by following training commands with increasing seriousness daily. They practiced dodging rolling tires because Ethan could not afford automated targets. They used hanging scrap metal to train timing, balance, and directional changes. Nyx chased painted bottle caps through narrow tunnels to improve visual tracking. Ethan discovered the hatchling learned patterns for faster than normal juvenile beasts. After 3 repetitions, Nyx could predict where every swinging obstacle would move. After 6, it began choosing routes Ethan had never demonstrated before. The bond transmitted flashes of instinct whenever Nyx committed to a movement. Ethan learned to sense those impulses and adjust his commands before speaking. Without realizing it, they were developing coordination. Most students practiced for years. Still, Nyx lacked a true attack strong enough for real combat. That changed when they found a dying ember hound beneath collapsed machinery. The abandoned beast had 1 injured leg and barely enough strength to breathe. Its former collar had been cut away, leaving raw skin around its neck. Ethan approached slowly with food, expecting the hound to attack from fear. Instead, it pushed the ration aside and looked toward Nyx weakly. The interface identified severe core collapse and unrecoverable elemental instability. Ethan knew enough beast medicine to understand the hound would not survive. Nyx sat beside it quietly, touching one small paw against the larger animal. A faint red glow moved from the hound into Nyx without visible pain. Ethan almost stopped the absorption until he noticed the hound relaxing completely. The energy transfer continued gently until the ember hound closed its eyes. Nyx remained beside the body long after the interface finished updating. Flame integration surged, but Ethan felt no excitement reading the result afterward. He buried the hound beneath scrap concrete where scavengers could not reach. Nyx placed the animal's broken collar on top before walking away silently. That night, neither of them trained. When they returned to the apartment, Ethan understood then that power always came from something, sometimes something painful. The next morning, Nyx produced its first deliberate flame without absorbing anything nearby. A thin red line danced across one claw and vanished after seconds. Ethan praised the attempt, and Nyx immediately tried again until collapsing backward. Skill seed acquired, Ember Claw. Status, incomplete, but stable. Over the following week, incomplete became functional through patient repetition and rest. Nyx learned to ignite both front claws without scorching its own fur. Then wind affinity shaped the flames backward, adding speed to every leap. Ethan called the combination Ember Step, though the void interface never named it. Nyx liked the sound enough to bark whenever Ethan shouted it aloud. Their secret progress continued until another scavenger noticed them inside the graveyard. His name was Trent, an older student expelled from a local combat program. He bonded with the scarred iron boar larger than Ethan's apartment kitchen. Trent made money stripping valuable components before city collectors arrived each morning. At first, he only watched Nyx moving through the scrap fields nearby. Then he saw the hatchling absorb energy from a fractured wind core. Greed changed his expression faster than recognition could reach Ethan's face. Trent blocked the exit with his iron boar and demanded Nyx immediately. Ethan pretended not to understand, but Trent described exactly what he witnessed. He offered money first, an amount larger than Ethan had ever held. When Ethan refused, Trent doubled it and promised nobody needed to know. Ethan refused again, placing himself between Nyx and the iron boar. Trent's friendliness disappeared, replaced by the confidence of someone choosing violence. He ordered the boar forward, claiming accidents happened constantly around unstable scrap piles. The iron beast charged, crushing an engine block beneath one armored hoof. Ethan shouted left, and Nyx moved before the command fully left him. Ember Step ignited beneath its paws, throwing the hatchling sideways through sparks. The boar smashed into stacked metal and turned with surprising speed afterward. Nyx's claws struck its flank, but the armor barely showed a mark. Trent laughed, telling Ethan that tricks could never replace actual combat power. Ethan knew he was right about one thing: Nyx could not win normally. So he stopped thinking like a student and remembered their graveyard training. He directed Nyx through narrow gaps the larger boar could barely navigate. Every missed charge loosened another tower of damaged machinery around them. Trent realized the trap only after Ethan led him beneath a hanging crane chain. Nyx cut the rusted release with Ember Claw at exactly Ethan's signal. A cargo magnet crashed between the fighters, forcing the boar sideways. Hard. Its metal armor reacted instantly, dragging the beast against the magnetic surface. Trent screamed and tried recalling his companion before the magnet fully engaged. Nyx lunged toward the exposed underside, claws glowing brighter than ever before. The interface flashed a warning. First evolution progress had reached 99%. One compatible energy trigger remained before the evolutionary transition could begin. Trent's iron boar thrashed violently, releasing dense earth element energy through its plating. Nyx froze, staring at that aura with hunger Ethan felt through their bond. Ethan hesitated because absorbing from a living beast could cause irreversible damage. Trent solved the dilemma by ordering his boar to kill Ethan outright. The beast tore free from the magnet and charged through falling debris. Ethan shouted for Nyx to take only what was necessary, nothing more. Nyx opened its mouth as the boar's earth aura slammed toward them. Brown gold energy peeled from the attack and spiraled into the tiny hatchling. The boar stumbled, weakened but alive, while Nyx vanished inside black light. A sound like distant thunder rolled through the entire abandoned disposal district. Ethan shielded his face as wind and ash exploded outward in circles. Inside the darkness, Nyx's silhouette stretched longer, taller, and suddenly unfamiliar. Its small ears sharpened, while three separate tails unfurled behind its body. Charcoal fur deepened to midnight black, edged with faint silver markings. Its paws doubled in size, and curved claws pressed into cracked concrete. The silver eyes returned first, brighter and more focused than before. Then black light collapsed inward, revealing a young hound standing chest high. Ethan could only stare because the creature looked nothing like a hatchling. The void interface replaced Nyx's unranked profile with a new classification. Evolution complete. New form, Shadow Pup. Multi-affinity retention stable. The first real power spike hit so hard, Trent's face immediately went pale. His iron boar growled, but even that hardened beast stepped backward once. Nyx looked at Ethan, then wagged all three tails with familiar excitement. That ridiculous gesture broke Ethan's shock and made him laugh from relief. Trent used the distraction to order another desperate charge from his companion. This time, Nyx met the attack instead of running from its path. Stone reinforcement hardened its forelegs while wind gathered behind its shoulders. Ember Claw ignited silver red as Nyx crossed the distance in one leap. The strike did not pierce the boar's armor. It twisted the beast sideways. Nyx followed with the frost-coated bite against one exposed rear joint. The iron boar collapsed, unable to keep weight on the numbed leg. Ethan immediately ordered Nyx to stop before the fight became punishment. Trent stared at his fallen beast and finally understood. The battle was finished. Ethan warned him that city cameras covered several entrances despite broken equipment. It was partly a bluff, but Trent was frightened enough to believe him. He recalled the boar and disappeared through the scrap maze without arguing. Only after Trent left did Ethan notice blood darkening Nyx's front shoulder. A fragment of iron armor had cut deeply during the final collision. Power had changed Nyx's body, but it had not made pain disappear. Ethan carried the larger creature toward a maintenance shelter beside the district. Nyx was now too heavy for him, yet Ethan refused to put it down. He cleaned the wound with warehouse supplies and wrapped it using his shirt. Nyx tried licking his hands until Ethan ordered the animal to remain still. The interface confirmed stable vitals and successful completion of the first evolution. 3 new skill branches appeared, each built from previously absorbed elements. Ethan ignored them for the moment, because Nyx was still trembling slightly. That choice strengthened something unseen inside their soul bond more than training. When they returned home, Ethan discovered an unfamiliar package outside his apartment. No delivery code appeared, and building cameras showed several missing minutes. Inside rested an old leather journal, sealed with his father's broken insignia. Ethan's hands shook before he even opened the first brittle page carefully. Most entries described ordinary expeditions, beast habitats, contracts, and research observations. Then the handwriting changed near the final third, becoming hurried and uneven. His father wrote repeatedly about creatures that possessed no natural elemental affinity. He called them void-born, not because they came from empty space. According to his notes, they survived by accepting what other species rejected. One sentence had been underlined so hard the ink tore through paper. A true void beast does not inherit evolution. It creates evolution itself. Ethan looked toward Nyx, sleeping beside the heater with 3 tails curled. The journal mentioned a legend older than modern tamer classification systems entirely. When elemental balance failed, something called the void beast supposedly appeared again. Some records named it a devourer capable of ending every bonded species. Others called the same creature the world's final defense against corruption. Ethan turned the page and found several lines violently scratched beyond readability. Only one complete name survived beneath the damage: Victor Kane. Beside it, Daniel had written that Kane would hunt any surviving void lineage. Another note warned that Kane saw bonds as containers for usable power. The final warning beneath both lines read simply, "Do not trust Apex." Ethan searched Victor Kane, but every public record ended decades earlier. Official histories listed him dead, leaving only erased citations and conspiracy threads. Ethan hid the journal under a loose floor panel before approaching cautiously. A woman in a dark academy coat waited beneath the hallway's broken light. She introduced herself as Professor Evelyn Shaw from Vanguard Academy's Beast Evolution Department. Ethan nearly closed the door because Vanguard had never contacted him directly. Shaw calmly displayed footage from municipal sensors near the abandoned graveyard. The recording showed only a burst of black light and corrupted measurements. She asked what kind of beast could produce an unregistered evolutionary signature. Ethan said nothing, keeping one hand on the door, while Nyx growled behind him. Shaw did not demand an answer. Instead, she placed an envelope down. Inside was a full Vanguard scholarship covering tuition, housing, food, and beast care. Ethan searched her expression for mockery and found only unsettling curiosity instead. Shaw said Vanguard valued anomalies more than perfect creatures. Everyone already understood. She gave him until sunrise to decide whether he wanted the place. After she left, Ethan reread his father's warning until the words blurred. "Do not trust Apex," the journal said, but it never mentioned Vanguard. Nyx rested its head on Ethan's knee while he considered everything ahead. Remaining here meant hiding forever, while powerful people eventually discovered them anyway. Entering Vanguard meant danger, but also knowledge he could never afford alone. Ethan finally signed the scholarship agreement just before the deadline expired. At sunrise, he packed his father's journal beside Nyx's medical supplies carefully. Neither of them knew who Professor Shaw truly served inside the academy, but together, they stepped toward Vanguard and the next stage of evolution. Vanguard Academy rose above the upper district like a fortress carved from black steel. Its training towers pierced cloud cover while flying beasts circled between suspended bridges. Ethan had only seen the campus through advertisements displayed inside public transit stations. Walking through the front gate felt like entering someone else's impossible future. Nyx stayed close, 3 tails tucked behind Ethan beneath curious students' stares. Every creature around them carried visible armor, elemental markings, or expensive enhancement gear. Several students recognized Ethan's low district uniform and whispered before checking Nyx's registry. The updated Shadow Pup classification stopped some laughter, but not all of it. Rare students dismissed unfamiliar species whenever scanners failed to assign prestigious bloodlines. Ethan preferred skepticism over attention from people who understood what Nyx truly did. Professor Shaw met them beneath an enormous statue of Vanguard's first headmaster. She handed Ethan a room key, schedule, and provisional combat evaluation notice. Tomorrow morning, she explained, every scholarship student would face placement trials publicly. Strong results could earn resources. Weak results could remove privileges immediately. Ethan asked whether that included his beast care allowance and housing support too. Shaw confirmed it without hesitation, making the scholarship suddenly feel less generous. Then her gaze settled on Nyx's silver eyes longer than necessary. She asked whether evolution had changed the creature's appetite in unusual ways. Ethan lied that Nyx only needed more protein and ordinary elemental supplements. Shaw smiled as if she heard the lie, but chose not to challenge it. Before leaving, she warned Ethan that Vanguard rewarded strength and punished visible weakness. Ethan looked across the elite campus and tightened his grip on Nyx's leash. Tomorrow, everyone at Vanguard would learn the weakest student had not arrived alone. Ethan's dorm room was larger than his entire apartment back home. Nyx inspected every corner twice before claiming the bed beside the window. Ethan unpacked little beyond clothes, medicine, the journal, and feeding supplies. His roommate assignment remained empty, which suited Ethan perfectly that first night. Through the window, he watched elite students training beneath artificial moonlight. Outside, lightning birds raced along aerial tracks while armored cats shattered moving stone targets. Vanguard did not feel like a school. It felt like a military city. Ethan studied placement regulations until exhaustion finally dragged him into shallow sleep. At dawn, warning bells summoned scholarship students toward the Eastern Combat Arena. Hundreds of spectators already filled elevated seats around 6 reinforced battle platforms. Performance rankings were public, apparently to encourage competition through controlled humiliation. Ethan immediately understood why students from wealthy families looked so relaxed nearby. They had trained since childhood with tutors, private arenas, and specialized nutrition programs. Ethan had rolling tires, abandoned scrap, and whatever Nyx could safely absorb. Still, their improvised training had taught something money could not purchase easily. They knew each other's movement before either side fully committed to action. The first trial measured obedience beneath sudden noise, smoke, and false threat projections. Several powerful beasts panicked when explosions triggered directly beside their training circles. Nyx barely flinched because the graveyard constantly collapsed around them during practice. Ethan guided it through the course without raising his voice above conversation level. Their synchronization score landed among the top 10, surprising nearby evaluators immediately. The second trial tested speed across platforms that changed direction without warning. A noble student's Winstag finished first, using pure acceleration across every gap. Nyx began slower, watching the platform rhythm instead of chasing the fastest route. Halfway through, Ethan sensed Nyx recognize a repeating sequence beneath the chaos. He gave one short command, and Nyx launched before platforms even aligned. Ember Step flashed beneath Black Paws, while Wind Affinity carried each landing. Nyx crossed the finish line second, missing first place by half a heartbeat. Students who mocked its unknown species suddenly started asking registration questions nearby. Ethan answered nothing and prepared for the final combat assessment instead. Professor Shou observed from a glass balcony beside several senior faculty members. Her expression never changed when Nyx's performance scores appeared above the arena. Ethan wondered whether she already expected every result they considered surprising. Below, the combat test matched students by projected power, experience, and beast classification ratings. Because Nyx remained poorly documented, the Academy matchmaking system assigned a stronger opponent. The crowd reacted when Avery Bennett stepped onto the opposite platform calmly. Her silver-blue Storm Fox moved beside her like a streak of living electricity. Ethan remembered both of them from the Bond Awakening ceremony months earlier. Avery remembered him too, although she seemed more interested in Nyx now. She introduced her companion as Volt, and warned Ethan the match was serious. Ethan appreciated the warning because nothing about her expression suggested cruelty or pity. The starting barrier dropped, and Volt disappeared before Nyx could lower itself. Blue light crossed the arena and struck Nyx's shoulder with explosive force. Ethan felt the impact through their bond like electricity under his skin. Nyx rolled, recovered, and narrowly avoided a second lightning dash immediately afterward. Avery controlled distance beautifully, never allowing Nyx a clean approach path. Ethan realized raw speed made Ember Step almost useless against Volt directly, so he changed tactics and ordered Nyx to stop chasing entirely. Nyx planted its paws near the center and watched every lightning trail carefully. Avery frowned, then sent Volt into another high-speed crossing attack pattern. Ethan waited until the final instant before calling Stone Brace and Frostbite. Nyx hardened one shoal, absorbed the impact, and caught Volt's rear leg. Frost spread across silver-blue fur before Avery recalled Volt out of range. The crowd shouted in surprise because Nyx had finally touched the faster beast. Volt's expression changed too. Playful confidence, becoming genuine combat focus immediately. Avery ordered a lightning cage surrounding Nyx with crackling blue arcs everywhere. The Void interface screamed multiple warnings about dangerous elemental density nearby. Nyx looked toward Ethan, clearly feeling the familiar hunger of void absorption. Ethan shook his head, because revealing the secret publicly would be reckless. Instead, he ordered Nyx upward, using an ability they rarely practiced openly. Wind gathered beneath Three Tails while Ember Step detonated against the platform. Nyx cleared the lightning cage by inches and landed behind Volt hard. Both beasts collided, rolled, and separated with matching cuts along their shoulders. The official ended the exchange when the assessment timer reached its limit. Avery still went on damage, but Nyx had nearly hard-countered Volt's speed. She approached while medics checked Volt and offered Ethan a respectful handshake. Then she quietly asked why her fox looked terrified during Ethan's ceremony. Ethan said he did not know, which was technically still the truth. Avery studied him for another second, clearly unconvinced, but not offended. A booming laugh interrupted them as a huge student approached carrying lunch trays. His name was Mason Grant, though everyone at Vanguard called him Tank. Beside him walked an earth golem shaped like a squat moving fortress. Mason had watched the match and declared Nyx's landing absolutely ridiculous. Ethan expected another insult until Mason asked how they trained that move. Within minutes, Mason was explaining cheap campus cafeterias and hidden practice fields. His golem, Rattless, accepted Nyx after one cautious, stone-handed sniff. Nyx responded by climbing onto Atlas's shoulder without permission from anyone. Mason laughed hard enough that several nearby students turned around annoyed. Ethan realized he had accidentally made his first actual friend at Vanguard. Placement results appeared that afternoon across every student's academy profile page. Ethan ranked 37th overall, far above expectations for a first-year scholarship entrant. His beast care allowance increased, and restricted training facilities became partially accessible. More importantly, the result granted entry into introductory dungeon field exercises soon. Ethan spent his first increased allowance on medical supplies instead of enhancement items. Nyx looked offended until Ethan added fresh meat to the purchase list. Mason invited Ethan to eat with several other students that evening downstairs. Avery appeared halfway through dinner, claiming every other table was crowded. Nobody believed her, but Mason welcomed her without making the excuse awkward. The three talked about field trials scheduled for later that month together. Avery knew dungeon theory better than most instructors and corrected Mason constantly. Mason wanted Frontier Rescue certification, where Atlas's defense could save trapped teams. Ethan contributed practical scavenging knowledge nobody else at the table possessed fully. For the first time, their differences felt useful instead of embarrassing to him. Professor Shaw interrupted after dinner and requested Ethan report to evolution research tomorrow. Her laboratory occupied a lower tower guarded by biometric locks and armed constructs. She claimed the security protected rare samples used for advanced beast studies. Ethan noticed several cages covered with black cloth behind reinforced glass doors. Nyx became restless immediately, claws scraping faintly against the polished floor. Shaw scanned its evolved form while asking harmless questions about feeding routines. Ethan answered carefully, omitting the graveyard, absorption, and his father's journal entirely. The scanner returned conflicting affinity readings that shifted every few seconds unpredictably. Shaw pretended surprise, but her eyes sharpened whenever darkness appeared on screen. She asked whether Nyx had ever consumed elemental material directly before evolution. Ethan said it occasionally chewed low-quality training crystals like many young beasts. Shaw accepted the answer outwardly and ended the examination sooner than expected. Before Ethan left, Nyx stared at one covered cage across the laboratory. Something underneath scratched once, then immediately went silent when Shaw turned around. Ethan felt Nyx's fear through their bond, mixed with something stranger. Recognition, perhaps, although Nyx had never entered this place before today. That night, Ethan opened his father's journal to sections about hidden laboratories. Several pages described experiments involving forced elemental transfer between bonded creatures. His father condemned the work as unstable, cruel, and fundamentally unnecessary. A triangle surrounding a black crown appeared beside those entries repeatedly. One margin note read, Project Sovereign, authorized directly by Victor Kane. Ethan stared, because the name from Daniel's warning now belonged to a project. Vanguard's public archives contained no Project Sovereign or matching research authorization. Nyx rested beside him while Ethan photographed every suspicious page securely. He uploaded encrypted copies to 3 separate anonymous storage accounts immediately. If someone took the journal, Daniel's evidence would no longer disappear completely. 2 days later, Vanguard announced the first Ashfall dungeon exercise assignments publicly. Ethan, Avery, and Mason landed inside the same 3-person expedition group. Mason celebrated loudly enough for Atlas to imitate him by pounding stone fists. Avery complained about the noise while hiding a small satisfied smile afterward. Professor Shaw volunteered to supervise their group during the dungeon expedition personally. Ethan felt his stomach tighten when he saw her name beside theirs. Nyx reacted too, three tails becoming still against the dormitory floor. The Ashfall dungeon was officially classified rare, dangerous, but controlled for students. Yet Ethan's father's journal had taught him that official labels could hide anything. On departure morning, he packed extra medicine and concealed the journal elsewhere. He also slipped an emergency tracking beacon inside Nyx's collar lining. Carefully, Mason noticed the additional equipment and asked whether Ethan expected a war. Ethan forced a smile and said, "Growing up poor made him overprepare." Avery watched him longer, clearly sensing he was hiding more than poverty. The transport doors sealed, carrying their team toward the dungeon beyond Vanguard. None of them knew the academy exercise had already become someone else's experiment. The Ashfall dungeon opened beneath a volcanic ridge 3 hours north of Vanguard. Black trees surrounded the entrance, their leaves permanently coated in gray mineral dust. Faculty barriers marked safe corridors through a labyrinth of collapsed lava tunnels. Every student team received maps, emergency seals, and strict extraction conditions beforehand. Shaw reminded them that careless tamers died even inside monitored training zones. Mason joked that her encouragement needed serious improvement before entering the gate. Avery ignored him and released Volt to scout ahead through the first tunnel. Ethan kept Nyx beside him instead of using a recall space immediately. The dungeoneer carried sulfur, moisture, old blood, and hundreds of elemental traces. Nyx shivered with overwhelming interest the moment they crossed the threshold. Fully, the void interface lit up with compatible signatures from nearly every direction. Ethan silently ordered restraint, because uncontrolled absorption could expose them instantly. Here, their first target was a colony of ashmites feeding near thermal vents. Atlas blocked the passage while Volt scattered lightning through the clustered creatures. Nyx intercepted stragglers using Ember Step and short frost-coated claw strikes efficiently. The team moved smoothly because every beast covered a different weakness. Naturally, Avery handled speed, Mason created defense, and Ethan adapted around both styles. Shaw observed from behind, without offering advice, unless safety thresholds approached. Ethan noticed she watched Nyx more than any other beast present there. The second zone narrowed into crystalline tunnels, reflecting distorted images around them. A venom-fanged serpent dropped from the ceiling before Volt detected movement overhead. Its fangs struck Atlas's shoulder, releasing green poison across the stone plating. Mason panicked because elemental venom could corrode even constructed beast cores slowly. Nyx lunged toward the serpent while Ethan ordered a distracting flame burst. The serpent turned, exposing its throat long enough for Volt to strike. Lightning stunned it, but the creature continued thrashing through fractured crystal pillars. Ethan saw toxic mist spreading toward Mason through the narrow tunnel ahead. Nyx opened its jaws and inhaled before Ethan could stop the reaction. Green vapor bent unnaturally, streaming straight into the darkness between its teeth. The void interface flashed poison affinity acquired and resistance building rapidly inside. Avery stared at Nyx, clearly realizing ordinary breathing could not explain that. Ethan had no time to invent anything, because the serpent recovered immediately. He ordered Nyx forward using the new resistance before the venom intensified again. Nyx bit through one fang, then twisted away beneath another sweeping strike. Volt finished the serpent with a concentrated bolt through its exposed skull. The tunnel fell silent except for Mason checking Atlas's damaged shoulder anxiously. Nyx approached the golem and sniffed the spreading poison across one crack. Ethan understood the intention, and hesitated only long enough to assess danger. He allowed a controlled absorption while Mason watched without understanding what happened. The green contamination drained from Atlas's shoulder directly into Nyx's mouth. Mason stared for several seconds before asking whether shadow pups normally did that. Ethan answered that Nyx had unusual resistance traits after its first evolution. Avery said nothing, but her expression made clear she believed much more. Shaw finally stepped forward and examined Atlas's restored elemental stability carefully. Her interest in Nyx sharpened behind the professional calm she maintained outwardly. The team continued deeper, though Ethan now felt every camera might be watching. An hour later, frozen air began leaking from cracks beneath the volcanic stone. Their map marked the region as an unstable overlap with subterranean frost channels. Avery called it impossible geology. Mason called it a terrible vacation spot. Nyx called it interesting by pulling hard enough to stretch Ethan's leash. They entered a cavern where ice covered half the walls in blue sheets. A frostbite lynx crouched above them, nearly invisible against the frozen ceiling. It attacked without warning, targeting Avery instead of her lightning companion nearby. Ethan sensed Nyx move before hearing his own command through the bond. Nyx slammed Avery aside and took frozen claws across its ribs instead. Blood splashed the ice, while cold spread instantly through the open wound. Ethan's fear hit Nyx through their connection like a physical shockwave. Nyx answered with a low growl, and refused to retreat behind Atlas. Volt attacked furious, lightning fracturing ice around the lynx's escape route. The beast leaped between pillars, using reflected images to confuse targeting systems. Ethan recognized the pattern because graveyard obstacles had trained similar visual deception. He closed his eyes and followed Nyx's instincts instead of the reflections. The bond showed motion as pressure, direction, and intent beneath ordinary sight. Ethan pointed left just before the real lynx emerged from mirrored ice. Nyx launched Ember Step and intercepted it directly in the chest mid-air. Both creatures crashed across the cavern, claws scraping sparks from frozen stone. The lynx released a burst of concentrated frost into Nyx's wounded side. Instead of freezing, the attack began sinking beneath the shadow pup's fur. Silver-blue light spread across Nyx's markings as void absorption activated uncontrollably. The lynx weakened rapidly while Ethan ordered Nyx not to drain beyond safety. Nyx broke contact, leaving the enemy exhausted, but still barely conscious. Afterward, Avery finished the encounter with a controlled lightning strike beside its head. The frostbite lynx fled through an upper crevice rather than continuing battle. Ethan rushed to Nyx while Mason unpacked emergency sealant and medical cloth. The wound looked terrible, but absorbed frost slowed bleeding around the edges. The void interface showed rising evolution progress, but Ethan closed the panel. The group sealed a side chamber and stopped long enough to breathe. Mason repaired Atlas while Avery pressed a cooling patch against Nyx's ribs. Ethan promised Nyx they would retreat before forcing another evolution just for progress. Nyx leaned into his palm, and only then did its trembling stop. According to their map, only a rare Ashgardian should occupy that area. Instead, the floor trembled beneath something much larger, moving behind black pillars. Shaw ordered the students back while trying to contact Academy Control immediately. No signal returned, and their extraction seals suddenly displayed connection failure warnings. Mason stopped joking. Atlas's battered shoulder already gave him reason to evacuate. Avery recalled Volt closer and asked Shaw whether multiple scanners could fail together. Shaw claimed volcanic interference sometimes caused brief disruptions in older tunnels nearby. Ethan did not believe her because the emergency seals used independent channels. A roar shook dust from the ceiling before anyone could argue further. Something massive stepped into view, with charred scales and ice between its horns. The scanner identified a Drake-class Guardian well above the student's assigned difficulty. Its body carried conflicting elemental corruption, as though several beasts had merged poorly. Nyx growled with recognition despite never encountering the creature before today. Ethan remembered the scratched journal pages describing forced elemental transfer experiments. The corrupted Drake looked exactly like the kind of failure his father condemned. Shaw ordered immediate retreat, giving Mason a clean chance to pull Atlas out. Mason saw the blocked route, then chose to hold the line instead. Atlas raised a stone wall while Volt blinded the Drake's exposed eye. The Drake shattered the wall and answered by flooding the cavern with frozen ash. Avery was knocked backward while Mason rebuilt Atlas's damaged guard stance. Anyway, Nyx attacked joints rather than armor, testing weaknesses with rapidly changing elements. Poison darkened one wound, frost slowed another, and flame widened existing cracks. The Drake adapted faster, smashing Nyx through a pillar with its armored tail. Ethan felt pain explode across the bond and nearly dropped to one knee. Shaw finally released her own contracted beast, a long silver mantis with blades. The mantis cut deeply across the Drake's neck, but failed to reach its core. Corruption erupted from the wound as unstable elemental energy flooded outward violently. Nyx stared at that energy while the interface issued repeated compatibility warnings. Second evolution progress rising. Multi-element convergence reached critical stability. Ethan knew absorbing everything might save them or destroy Nyx completely inside. The Drake charged Shaw while her mantis struggled to recover position quickly. Ethan chose the only option that protected everyone without abandoning Nyx's judgment. He released the restraint command and told Nyx to take what it needed. Nyx planted its paws, opened its mouth, and pulled against the corruption. Streams of black, blue, green, and red energy tore from the Drake. The cavern lights dimmed as every element spiraled around Nyx's body violently. Its three tails stretched, hardened, and merged beneath scales growing through fur. Shoulders widened while forelegs lengthened into something built for heavier combat entirely. A narrow pair of wings burst outward, scattering fragments of black crystal. The head became draconic, though silver eyes remained unmistakably Nyx's own. Venom traced green beneath new scales, while frost gathered between sharp teeth. Shadow coated the wings, and flame pulsed red along the chest cavity. The corrupted guardian collapsed as stolen instability finally left its ruined body. Nyx rose from the energy storm as a young but unmistakable Drake. The Void interface identified the new form before Academy scanners could respond. Evolution complete. Void Fang Drake established. 3 breath affinities synchronized. For one stunned second, nobody inside the chamber remembered the surrounding danger. Then Nyx opened new wings and lifted several feet above the ground. Nyx exhaled frost across falling debris, proving the new breath before landing. Mason shouted in disbelief, while Avery simply stared with widened, electric blue eyes. Even Professor Shaw lost control of her expression for one revealing moment. Ethan saw hunger there, not academic wonder, before her professional mask returned. The dungeon had given Nyx another evolution, but it also exposed everything. And somewhere beyond the broken signal, someone had just received the data. That unseen observer had been waiting years for a void beast to appear. The Academy extraction system returned moments after Nyx's evolution finished inside the chamber. Emergency teams flooded the dungeon, blaming corrupted equipment for the communication blackout. Shaw repeated that explanation so smoothly that nobody challenged her immediately. There, Ethan noticed she quietly removed one damaged recorder before technicians reached the area. Back at Vanguard, Nyx's new form triggered mandatory quarantine and examination procedures. Official scanners classified the Void Fang Drake as epic rank, despite unstable affinity readings. That night, Ethan sat on an infirmary rooftop while Nyx watched city lights. The Drake barely fit beside him, yet still nudged his shoulder like before. Ethan admitted he feared evolution might eventually erase the creature he knew. Nyx rested its head against him, answering that fear without words. Avery found Ethan leaving the rooftop and demanded a real explanation this time. She had watched poison vanish, frost disappear, and corrupted energy enter Nyx directly. Ethan could no longer pretend those events were unusual resistance or coincidence. He admitted Nyx absorbed certain elemental energies under specific conditions. He still withheld the Void interface, Daniel's journal, and the Void prophecy. Avery looked angry about the secrecy, but not because she wanted power. She said hidden danger could get Mason, Volt, or civilians killed someday. Ethan accepted the criticism because she was completely right about that risk. Avery said she would not report him tonight, but trust was no longer automatic. She left before Ethan could answer, taking Volt silently down the stairwell. Mason arrived moments later, understood what happened, and stopped making jokes. He told Ethan, friendship never erased the consequences of dangerous secrecy. Then Ethan noticed Professor Shaw watching them from an upper corridor window. She disappeared the moment their eyes met through the glass above. That evening, Ethan moved his father's journal to a hidden maintenance locker. He kept only photographed pages inside an encrypted offline drive afterward. Nyx refused to sleep and paced the dorm with wings tightly folded. Ethan felt unease through their bond without understanding its exact source. Near midnight, the building ventilation stopped for 3 seconds, then restarted quietly. A sweet metallic smell drifted into the room from the ceiling vents. Ethan recognized tranquilizer vapor from warehouse shipments used for dangerous beasts transport. He grabbed Nyx's collar, but his legs weakened before reaching the door. Nyx roared and tried spreading its wings as the gas thickened rapidly. The last thing Ethan saw was black armored figures entering without Academy insignia. He woke strapped upright inside a windowless chamber lit by cold white panels. Metal restraints covered his wrists, ankles, chest, and neck against the chair. His bond with Nyx felt distant, muffled, and painfully difficult to reach. Across reinforced glass, Nyx struggled inside a cage shaped from dark metal. Blue runes crawled across every bar whenever the Drake touched them angrily. Each contact released a shock that forced Nyx backward onto the floor. Ethan shouted its name until his throat burned against the restraint collar. Nyx lifted its head, silver eyes focusing immediately despite obvious pain. A hidden door opened, and Professor Shaw entered wearing no Academy coat. Instead, a black triangle surrounding a crown marked her fitted uniform chest. Ethan recognized the symbol from his father's journal before she said anything. Apex Syndicate, he whispered, finally understanding the warning written years earlier. Shaw corrected him calmly, calling Apex older and larger than any corporation. She described it as a network built around controlled advancement of bonded species. Governments tolerated them when useful, and denied their existence whenever experiments failed. Ethan asked whether the corrupted Drake inside Ashfall Dungeon belonged to them. Shaw admitted it was an outdated prototype scheduled for disposal months earlier. She had redirected it into the exercise to force Nyx's ability into view. Ethan felt nausea replace fear as every suspicious moment finally connected together. His scholarship, placement, research visits, and dungeon assignment had all been arranged. Shaw never discovered Nyx by accident. She had been waiting for confirmation. She explained that Apex had tracked Ethan's father before his final expedition. He found records suggesting void beasts could safely integrate incompatible elemental cores. Apex wanted that trait because forced fusion destroyed most experimental subjects eventually. Ethan's father refused cooperation after witnessing what their researchers did to companions. He stole part of their archive and vanished before exposing the organization publicly. Ethan demanded to know whether Apex had killed him during that escape. Shaw said only Victor Kane's inner circle could access Daniel's final records. Hearing Kane's name from her mouth turned old journal fear into present danger. Then Shaw turned toward Nyx and activated several diagnostic screens around the cage. Voidfang Drake displayed stable flame, frost, poison, shadow, and wind integration simultaneously. No ordinary core should survive that many conflicting affinities without catastrophic collapse. Shaw sounded almost reverent while describing Nyx as biological perfection. Ethan told her Nyx was not an experiment and never would become one. Shaw replied that ownership meant little once global security became involved officially. She believed void evolution could reshape every military, medical, and industrial beast program. If one creature could absorb corruption safely, millions might benefit from replicating it. Ethan asked how many creatures they had already killed trying to replicate that miracle. For the first time, Shaw stopped answering and looked toward the floor. That silence told Ethan everything. His father's journal had tried to warn him. Technicians entered and rolled a machine beside Nyx's containment cage slowly. Its needles carried extraction ports designed to sample elemental tissue and core energy. Nyx backed away until metal bars pressed painfully against its folded wings. Ethan fought the restraints hard enough to tear skin around both wrists. Shaw ordered him sedated before emotional stress destabilized the bonded specimen further. A technician injected something cold through the line attached to Ethan's arm. His vision blurred, but terror kept him conscious longer than they expected. He watched the first extraction needle move toward Nyx's armored chest. Nyx snapped at it and received another violent shock from the cage. Ethan apologized without knowing whether words could cross the suppressed soul bond. He had promised never to abandon Nyx when everyone else called it worthless. Now, power had brought them exactly where he always feared they might end. Nyx lowered its head after another shock and stopped fighting the bars. Shaw mistook the silence for submission and told technicians to continue forward. Ethan felt something through the bond then, faint but unmistakably deliberate. Nyx was not surrendering. It was listening for Ethan beneath the suppression field. He closed his eyes and stopped pulling against the physical restraints entirely. Instead, Ethan focused on every memory connected to the creature inside glass. The warm towel beside the broken heater returned first to his mind. Then broth, cheap nutrient paste, and three tails wagging after evolution appeared. He remembered carrying Nyx while blood soaked through his only clean shirt. He remembered choosing medical supplies over enhancement crystals at Vanguard campus. Each memory strengthened the bond signal by another almost invisible fraction. Nyx's breathing changed, slowing until it matched Ethan's own strained rhythm. Shaw noticed unusual synchronization data and ordered suppression increased by 20%. The cage runes brightened, sending pressure across Ethan's chest through the bond. Instead of separating them, the pain gave both sides one shared sensation. Ethan finally reached Nyx clearly enough to send a single wordless intention. One word crossed their suppressed bond with absolute clarity between them. Together. Nyx opened its silver eyes, and every rune on the cage flickered once. The void interface appeared inside Ethan's blurred vision despite all suppression fields. New bond resonance detected. External energy pattern available for void integration analysis. Ethan understood before the technicians did what opportunity the cage itself provided. Its anti-magic field used a constant energy frequency to block elemental abilities. Nyx had never absorbed engineered suppression energy, but void absorption could attempt it. Ethan silently gave permission while pretending the drug had finally overwhelmed him. Nyx remained motionless as black threads began creeping along the cage floor. The technicians watched core readings, never noticing their containment output dropping gradually. 1% became 3, then 7, then 12, without triggering alarms. Nyx learned the frequency by tasting microscopic pieces rather than devouring everything. Ethan felt each fragment through the bond like cold metal behind his teeth. Shaw leaned closer to the monitors when suppression efficiency dipped below normal range. She ordered technicians to recalibrate before continuing the invasive core extraction procedure. That pause gave Nyx exactly the additional seconds it needed to adapt. Void integration complete, the Void interface announced inside Ethan's dim vision. New trait unlocked, energy absorption. Non-elemental power structures now partially consumable. Nyx lifted its head as every cage rune suddenly turned completely black. Shaw realized what happened one heartbeat before the containment bars began cracking. She shouted for emergency reinforcement while technicians scattered from the platform. Nyx inhaled, and blue suppression light ripped from every surface around it. The cage collapsed inward as its own power vanished into the Void Fang Drake. A shockwave shattered the reinforced observation glass between Ethan and Nyx instantly. Fragments crossed the room while alarm sirens screamed through hidden corridors everywhere. Nyx launched through broken glass and landed directly beside Ethan's chair. One claw cut his restraints without touching the skin beneath the metal. Ethan collapsed forward, and Nyx caught him against one scaled shoulder. Shaw summoned her silver mantis while security doors sealed every possible exit. Ethan was drugged, bleeding, and barely able to stand without support. But Nyx had just turned Apex's supposed hard counter into another power source. Their perfect cage had become fuel, making energy absorption look completely busted. The silver mantis crossed the room before Ethan could fully raise his head. Nyx caught one blade between armored jaws and twisted with brutal force. Metal shrieked as the mantis lost balance against the reinforced laboratory floor. Shaw ordered a second strike while retreating toward an emergency command terminal. Ethan recognized the terminal as the control point for every sealed door. He sent Nyx forward, but armed guards entered from two side corridors. Stun rifles released blue bolts designed to disable bonded beasts without killing. Nyx opened its wings and absorbed the first volley across its chest. Energy vanished into black scales while the Void interface climbed rapidly upward. The guards hesitated, never trained for a target strengthened by suppression fire. Ethan shouted for Nyx to redirect them away from the technicians nearby. The Drake slammed one wing into the floor and released stored energy outward. A circular pulse threw armed guards backward without tearing through their armor. Shaw reached the command terminal and triggered maximum containment across the entire facility. Walls unfolded, revealing layers of glowing conduits surrounding Ethan and Nyx together. The containment network began draining ambient elemental energy from everything inside the laboratory. Shaw claimed even void absorption required something available to consume first. Ethan looked at the dimming lights and realized she had misunderstood Nyx completely. Energy absorption no longer depended on natural elemental signatures alone anymore. Nyx lowered its body while every conduit poured suppression power through the room. Ethan felt the creature asked permission through their sharpened bond once again. He answered without words, trusting Nyx over warnings flashing across the Void interface. The Drake opened its jaws, and darkness folded around the laboratory center. Light stretched into thin lines as power rushed toward one impossible point. Conduits burst from overload while floor panels ripped free from their mounts. The Void interface named the unstable technique before Ethan could understand it. Void singularity. Provisional manifestation. Energy intake radius expanding beyond safe limits. Shaw screamed for immediate shutdown, but the control terminal had already died. Her silver mantis dug blades into concrete to resist the growing pull. Guards abandoned weapons and grabbed railings as gravity seemed to tilt sideways. Ethan placed one hand against Nyx's shoulder and asked it to stop. The singularity collapsed instantly, proving their bond remained stronger than hunger. Every surviving light inside the room returned weakly after several dark seconds. Shaw stared at Ethan with fear replacing the curiosity she always wore. She whispered that the prophecy had been right about the Void Beast. Ethan demanded the complete truth, but alarms announced external Academy forces approaching. Shaw used the distraction to activate a hidden escape passage behind laboratory panels. Before disappearing, she warned Ethan that Apex would never stop hunting Nyx. Then she added one final sentence his father had apparently discovered first. The Void Beast will destroy this world, she said, or save it. Academy security breached the facility minutes later, and found illegal Apex equipment everywhere. Ethan surrendered peacefully only after confirming Nyx would remain beside him. Avery and Mason arrived with faculty teams, both furious and visibly relieved. But relief vanished when Vanguard's council issued an immediate emergency summons. The council wanted answers about Apex, Void Singularity, and an unregistered epic evolution, and some members were already demanding that Nyx be confiscated permanently. Vanguard's emergency council chamber sat beneath the oldest tower on campus. Its circular walls displayed the names of tamers killed protecting the academy. Ethan entered beside Nyx under escort, refusing every offered recall restraint. The Void-fanged Drake walked quietly, wings folded and silver eyes scanning exits. Avery had been ordered to submit a written safety statement before any testimony. Professor Shaw's abandoned laboratory evidence filled 3 sealed tables near the council. Broken cages, corrupted samples, and Apex insignias left little doubt about infiltration. Still, several council members focused almost entirely on Nyx rather than Apex. They argued that a beast capable of consuming containment technology threatened global security. One demanded immediate separation until researchers understood its upper absorption limit completely. Ethan asked whether those researchers would resemble the ones who kidnapped them yesterday. The chamber went silent except for Nyx's claws touching polished stone slowly. Headmaster Marcus Hale warned Ethan that anger would not determine academy policy. Ethan replied that fear should not determine it either. When evidence remained incomplete, a military representative presented recordings of Void Singularity tearing apart the laboratory. He called the technique strategically unacceptable for an uncontrolled first-year companion beast. Ethan pointed out that Nyx stopped instantly when he asked it to. The representative said obedience today did not guarantee obedience after future evolutions. Another council member suggested transferring Nyx to a national containment sanctuary permanently. Ethan recognized the polite wording as confiscation without admitting the word openly. Nyx felt his fear through their bond and stepped closer to his side. That simple movement made several officials tense, as though facing an attack. Headmaster Hale ordered everyone to stop treating the beast like a loaded weapon. He then asked Ethan to explain void absorption from the very beginning honestly. Ethan hesitated before deciding. Secrecy had become more dangerous than controlled disclosure. He described the accidental flame absorption behind school after the ceremony. Then he explained the graveyard fragments, first evolution, dungeon, energy, and cage. He did not mention every void interface detail, but revealed its functional warnings. Several researchers exchanged shocked looks when he described self-limited absorption thresholds. Nyx had repeatedly stopped before draining living opponents beyond safe levels. Ethan emphasized that those limits came through training and bond communication together. A council biologist asked whether Nyx ever ignored direct commands during dangerous feeding. Ethan admitted curiosity sometimes caused hesitation, but never deliberate lethal disobedience. The military representative called that answer insufficient for a creature with growing power. Security interrupted the closed hearing after someone surrendered a student badge outside. Avery stepped through the doors, fully aware of what that badge could cost. Interrupting the hearing could cost her scholarship, ranking, and field certification. Headmaster Hale warned her once, then asked whether she still wished to speak. Avery looked at Nyx, remembered the dungeon, and answered yes without hesitation. She described Nyx taking the frostbite lynx attack meant for her. She described Ethan limiting absorption, even when more power could secure victory. Mason followed, putting his frontier rescue certification at risk beside his badge. He testified that Nyx saved Atlas earlier, then protected them during Mason's retreat decision. The military representative dismissed both testimonies as emotionally compromised friendship immediately. Avery admitted anger had nearly convinced her to stay silent when it mattered. Mason added that rescue rules meant nothing if fear decided who deserved saving. Even Headmaster Hale looked impressed before hiding it behind folded hands. A new voice spoke from the chamber's upper gallery before debate continued. An elderly man in a weathered travel coat stood where nobody noticed him. Security moved instantly, but Headmaster Hale raised one hand and stopped them. He introduced the stranger as Master Adrian Crow, former world-ranked legendary tamer. Ethan knew the name from history lessons about the Northern Rift disaster. Crow had disappeared from public life nearly 20 years earlier without explanation. The old tamer descended slowly, carrying no weapon and displaying no companion. He stopped several feet from Nyx and looked directly into silver eyes. Nyx did not growl, retreat, or show the fear it displayed around Shaw. Instead, the drake lowered its head as though recognizing a forgotten scent. Crow whispered something under his breath, and Nyx's silver eyes sharpened instantly. The name was Eclipse, though nobody else in the chamber understood it. A ripple of black light appeared behind him and filled the gallery shadows. From darkness emerged a scarred beast shaped like a lean obsidian wolf. Its body carried faded silver markings, eerily similar to Nyx's first form. Every scanner in the chamber failed simultaneously when the creature fully appeared. Ethan's void interface reacted with an identification error followed by one phrase. Void lineage resonance detected. Distant compatible evolutionary origin confirmed nearby. The council chamber erupted into overlapping questions, demands, and security warnings. Crow ignored them and explained that Eclipse bonded with him 50 years earlier. Back then, scanners also classified the creature as elementless, unknown, and useless. Eclipse never reached Nyx's current absorption range, but its growth defied normal branches. Crow spent decades searching ancient records after surviving the Northern Rift incident. Those records described void-born creatures appearing during periods of spreading beast corruption. Not destroyers, Crow said, but regulators that consumed unstable energy ecosystems produced. He called them the world's immune response to elemental imbalance and artificial corruption. Some civilizations worshipped them, while others hunted them until every record vanished. A council historian challenged his evidence and demanded verifiable modern biological data. Crow responded by placing a sealed archive drive on the central table. It contained 50 years of Eclipse's medical scans, battles, and controlled absorption studies. Headmaster Hale ordered immediate authentication while the council session temporarily paused. Ethan approached Crow quietly and asked whether he knew Ethan's father personally. The old man's expression changed before he answered with careful honesty. He knew Daniel Cole, and Daniel had contacted him shortly before disappearing. Ethan's chest tightened hearing his father's name spoken by someone who remembered him. Crow said Daniel believed Apex's true architect, Victor Kane, survived the first rift. At Kane's name, Crow went still while Eclipse stepped between him and Nyx. Daniel feared Kane wanted a void beast to stabilize stolen bonds permanently. Ethan asked whether his father survived the expedition Apex, classified as fatal. Crow could not answer. Daniel vanished before their planned second meeting occurred. But he confirmed the official death report lacked evidence, even by Academy standards. That uncertainty reopened a wound Ethan had forced himself to bury years ago. Nyx pressed one scaled shoulder against him until his breathing steadied again. When council members returned, the authenticated archive changed the hearing significantly. Eclipse's history proved void integration could remain stable across multiple decades safely. Crow's records also showed bond strength directly affected absorption control and identity. He explained deep soul bonds carried synchronized emotional signatures beyond ordinary commands. Every bonded pair developed a resonance pattern through repeated trust, fear, and choice. Forced suppression could bury that pattern, making beasts controllable but dangerously unstable. Separating a void beast from its tamer would destroy its strongest stabilizing signal. That made the council's proposed confiscation plan the most dangerous available option. Headmaster Hale called for a final vote after reviewing every submitted report. Several members demanded restrictions, but permanent separation quickly lost majority support. Nyx would remain with Ethan under continuous monitoring and scheduled medical evaluation. Ethan kept his scholarship, although off-campus travel required advance authorization afterward. Crow volunteered to design emergency protocols without invasive restraints or forced suppression. Ethan accepted the ruling while insisting Apex remained the greater threat. Headmaster Hale agreed and ordered a full investigation across Vanguard departments. Shaw's credentials, research access, and financial records were frozen immediately afterward. Several missing low-tier beasts were connected to her unauthorized research network. Mason looked sick when the scale of those disappearances became public. Avery admitted she had nearly let anger decide her choice at the hearing. Ethan apologized for the secrecy without asking her to forget its reasons. Avery accepted, but demanded full danger disclosures before every future team mission. Crow then began meeting Ethan privately to teach controlled void absorption safely. He never treated Nyx like an artifact, weapon, or prophecy machine. Instead, he asked what Nyx enjoyed, feared, and chose without commands. Crow showed Ethan how suppression lattices lock onto a beast's dominant soul frequency. They resisted force, but weakened when internal bonded resonance restored itself correctly. That restoration required memory, trust, and voluntary synchronization, rather than stronger attacks. Ethan did not know why that lesson mattered yet, but remembered it. Some days, Nyx rejected compatible materials despite tempting rare cores nearby. Their bond matured as weeks became months, and months quietly became 3 years. Then Vanguard announced the World Tamer Championship, drawing elite tamers from every region. The event would bring elite competitors from every major academy and national league. Ethan saw an opportunity to test Nyx against strong opponents under official protections. Blake Sterling saw the same announcement and registered before Ethan finished reading it. For the first time since their awakening, both boys were heading toward one arena. Championship Week transformed Vanguard into the loudest place Ethan had ever seen. Broadcast towers surrounded the arena while sponsor banners covered every visible wall. Tamers arrived from distant regions with beasts Ethan only knew from textbooks. Winged serpents crossed the sky above armored bears and crystalline insects below. Every competitor carried rankings, endorsements, and supporters chanting from crowded gates. Ethan carried one repaired backpack and Nyx's favorite dried meat inside it. The contrast made Mason laugh until Avery reminded him cameras were everywhere. Public interest in the mysterious Voidfang Drake had grown beyond academy rumors. Analysts debated whether Nyx's evolution represented mutation, fraud, or hidden royal breeding. Nobody outside Vanguard knew the full truth about void absorption yet. Officially, Headmaster Hale insisted sensitive details remain sealed while Apex investigations continued worldwide. Ethan appreciated secrecy, though constant attention made hiding anything increasingly difficult now. The championship opened with group battles designed to eliminate weaker competitors quickly. Ethan's first opponent bonded with the Wind Mantis, famous for cutting projectiles apart. The Mantis controlled range, filling the arena with invisible pressure blades repeatedly. Nyx avoided most attacks, but collected shallow cuts across both wing membranes. Ethan noticed every blade carried a stable wind signature. Nyx already understood. He allowed minimal absorption only from attacks that struck directly against scales. The energy reinforced Nyx's airflow control without revealing the full mechanism publicly. Then Ethan ordered a low ember step beneath both rear claws simultaneously. Nyx accelerated into the Mantis's blind side before another pressure blade formed. One shoulder strike knocked the lighter beast outside the boundary without serious injury. The match ended in under 4 minutes, surprising commentators expecting a longer struggle. Round 2 paired Ethan against a water-armored crocodile built for endurance fighting. Every direct strike slid across liquid armor and lost most physical force. Instead of increasing power, Ethan told Nyx to attack the arena floor. Frost breath spread under the crocodile's feet, turning water defense into weight. The heavy beast slowed while Nyx circled beyond its shortened attack range. A final wind-assisted tackle pushed it across the boundary before armor thawed. Ethan advanced again without exposing void singularity or dangerous absorption levels publicly. Crow approved from the stands, saying restraint revealed more skill than spectacle. Blake advanced too, with Solarius steamrolling every opponent through overwhelming raw power. The Golden Beast had matured enormously since the Bond Awakening ceremony years earlier. Its mane burned like sunlight, and every roar shook reinforced arena shields. Commentators called Solarius one of the youngest verified god-tier beasts alive. Blake never needed complicated tactics because few beasts survived direct exchanges anyway. Ethan watched those victories carefully instead of dismissing Blake as arrogant competition. Solarius was genuinely extraordinary, fast enough to punish almost any tactical mistake. Avery also advanced through early rounds with Volt's refined lightning control intact. Mason lost narrowly in the 3rd round after Atlas protected him from injury. He accepted elimination cheerfully and immediately became Ethan's loudest unofficial corner coach. By quarterfinals, championship broadcasts focused heavily on Ethan's improbable rise through brackets. Reporters repeated his slum background, unranked ceremony result, and unknown evolving species. Some called him inspirational. Others accused Vanguard of hiding illegal enhancement research. Ethan hated both narratives because neither treated Nyx as an individual creature. Before the quarter-final match, Nyx refused its usual meal and stared outside quietly. Ethan sensed pressure building through the bond, like approaching weather under skin. The void interface showed evolution progress climbing after recent controlled absorptions. No transition threshold had been reached, but several pathways were converging unexpectedly. Crow warned Ethan not to chase evolution simply because cameras expected spectacle. Ethan promised he would stop any absorption if Nyx showed instability or fear. The quarter-final opponent was Sophie Chen, an international prodigy bonded with Storm Lynx. Her companion used lightning similar to Volt's, but with far greater raw output. Avery warned Ethan that Sophie specialized in forcing opponents into defensive exhaustion. The opening seconds proved her right, as lightning filled every escape corridor. Nyx blocked with shadowed wings, but repeated impacts drove it backward steadily. Ethan sensed each strike, feeding tiny compatible fragments into Nyx's core automatically. The Drake wanted permission to take more, yet Ethan held restraint initially. Sophie increased output, surrounding Nyx with a rotating storm cage across the arena. Commentators predicted surrender because even epic barriers failed inside that technique frequently. Nyx lowered its head and looked directly toward Ethan through flashing blue light. This time, the request carried confidence rather than desperate hunger or panic. Ethan trusted that difference and released the absorption limit by one controlled stage. Lightning bent along Nyx's scales instead of exploding across them normally. Sophie's expression changed when pieces of her storm disappeared into black armor. The interface registered stable lightning integration and a completed evolution pathway. Nyx roared, not from pain, but from something powerful changing underneath scales. Ethan felt the threshold arrive one heartbeat before the entire arena darkened. 5 elemental colors spiraled above Nyx, while lightning formed a 6th temporary crown. Its body expanded rapidly, forcing the surrounding storm cage outward across shields. Wings lengthened until their shadow covered nearly half the fighting platform below. Forelegs thickened, scales sharpened, and 3 tails split into broader armored fins. Frost crystals formed along one wing while ember light traced the other. Poison green moved beneath the neck, and violet shadow coated every joint. Lightning finally settled into silver veins crossing the expanding chest plates. The transformation alarm sounded automatically because scanners exceeded expected energy ranges. Sophie recalled her Storm Lynx backward while officials prepared emergency interruption protocols. Ethan kept one hand raised, feeling Nyx's mind remain completely present inside. The Void interface finished calculating and displayed a new species classification. Evolution complete. Abyssal Wyvern established. 6 elemental channels synchronized successfully. That power spike was immediate. One roar from Nyx silenced the entire stadium. The new form stood taller than any beast Ethan had previously commanded. Yet when Ethan whispered Nyx's name, one tail tapped the ground twice. That familiar gesture told him the creature inside had not disappeared anywhere. Officials allowed the match to continue after verifying bond stability and medical clearance. Sophie attacked immediately, knowing hesitation would only strengthen the transformed opponent further. Her Storm Lynx became pure lightning and crossed the platform almost invisibly. Nyx tracked the movement with silver eyes sharpened by integrated elemental perception. One wing created wind pressure while Frost formed a curved barrier ahead. The lightning beast struck ice, redirected sideways, and lost its ideal angle. Nyx followed with shadow movement and appeared directly behind the surprised Lynx. Instead of using claws, it struck with one controlled wing against armor. Sophie's companion slid beyond the boundary, ending the quarter-final without serious injury. The crowd erupted so loudly that broadcast microphones automatically reduced sensitivity levels. Analysts immediately argued whether Nyx's new power scaling now reached legendary rank. Ethan ignored them and checked Nyx's breathing, wings, and core stability first. Crow smiled when he saw that priority and said nothing needed explaining. The semi-final bracket appeared moments later across every arena screen simultaneously. Ethan Cole versus Blake Sterling, the matchup everyone had wanted since qualifiers. Blake entered their waiting corridor before officials called either competitor forward. He looked older than the boy who mocked Ethan's hatchling years earlier, but the same confidence remained whenever Solarius walked beside his shoulder nearby. Blake said Ethan had finally become interesting enough to defeat publicly today. Ethan replied that Nyx had never needed Blake's approval to become valuable. The answer irritated Blake more deeply than any insult could have done. Their semi-final began beneath a stadium divided between golden and black banners. Solarius opened with a solar roar that shattered 3 defensive shield layers. Nyx crossed wings over Ethan, absorbing heat, but not the concussive impact fully. The force pushed both backward, while cracks spread beneath the wyvern's claws. Ethan understood immediately that Solarius remained stronger in direct raw output, so he ordered movement, forcing Blake to turn the massive lion repeatedly. Nyx used wind bursts, shadow steps, and frost patches to control positioning. Blake answered by filling the platform with expanding waves of golden fire. Avoiding everything became impossible, leaving Ethan one dangerous alternative available. He allowed Nyx to absorb only the flames, threatening direct contact nearby. Golden fire disappeared against black scales in widening patches around the wyvern. Blake finally saw the secret mechanism clearly and ordered maximum solar discharge. Solarius opened its jaws as a miniature sun formed above its tongue. The audience barriers strengthened automatically while officials shouted evacuation warnings nearby. Ethan felt Nyx's hunger surge, then steady itself without needing restraint. That self-control convinced him they were ready for one controlled counterattack together. Solarius released the solar blast, turning the entire arena white for seconds. Nyx opened both wings and let darkness curve around the incoming beam. Most energy vanished inward while the remaining forced her trenches beside them. The interface warned that elemental saturation was approaching dangerous but survivable limits. Ethan ordered release before Nyx stored more than its new core could handle. The abyssal wyvern redirected absorbed heat through frost, wind, and shadow channels. A black-silver wave struck Solarius beneath its golden mane and lifted it. The god-tier solar lion crashed outside the boundary without losing consciousness. For several seconds, Blake remained perfectly still beside the empty platform edge. The boy Blake once called trash tier had just completely humbled him before the world. Ethan did not celebrate over him. He immediately recalled Nyx from combat stance. That restraint hurt Blake's pride more than mockery would have managed today. Officials raised Ethan's arm while the stadium exploded into stunned celebration everywhere. But before the finalist announcement finished, every arena screen turned completely black. Static replaced the championship feed, while emergency lights switched to crimson immediately. A low siren rolled through Vanguard, followed by impacts outside the stadium. Something massive struck the northern barrier and shattered an entire observation tower. Students screamed as corrupted beasts poured through smoke above the arena walls. Some had extra limbs, fused armor, or elemental cores glowing through torn skin. Ethan recognized the same artificial instability he saw inside Ashfall Dungeon earlier. This was Apex research, except expanded into an army large enough for war. Faculty tamers released companions while security barriers divided civilians from combat zones. Mason summoned Atlas near an evacuation corridor and began shielding younger students. Avery and Volt joined him, striking corrupted flyers before they reached spectators. Blake remained frozen beside Solarius until Ethan shouted his name sharply once. That snapped him back, and the Golden Lion rose despite semi-final injuries. For once, Blake attacked beside Ethan instead of trying to stand above him. Nyx launched upward and intercepted 3 corrupted wyverns crossing the stadium roof. Its new wings turned sharply despite massive size, surprising even Ethan below. Poison breath disabled one enemy while frost locked another against falling debris. A third exploded with unstable flame, forcing Nyx to absorb the blast directly. Crow appeared beside Eclipse near the arena floor without any visible urgency. He looked toward the sky and immediately understood. This was not random terrorism. Apex was targeting the championship because thousands of bonded elites gathered here. Then every corrupted beast suddenly stopped attacking at exactly the same moment. Silence spread through the ruined stadium, more frightening than the earlier chaos. A black doorway opened above the central arena without touching any physical structure. A strangely youthful man stepped through, wearing armor covered in broken bond crystals. His face looked calm, almost gentle, despite the destruction surrounding him below. Crow whispered Victor Kane's name, confirming the nightmare Daniel had warned about. Victor Kane had led Apex's deepest research circle for more than a century. Official histories listed him dead during the First Rift, 40 years earlier. Crow said those histories were convenient lies protecting governments using Apex technology. Kane raised one hand, and every corrupted beast bowed toward him. Then translucent shapes appeared behind his armor like trapped creatures made from smoke. Hundreds of beast silhouettes twisted around him, each attached by glowing chains. Ethan's void interface reacted with warnings more severe than anything seen before. Foreign soul signatures detected, forced bond consumption occurring across multiple life patterns. Kane had survived by absorbing contracted beast souls from generation after generation. Each stolen bond extended his life while expanding the number of powers available. The broken crystals on his armor were not decorations, but shattered contracts. Kane addressed the stadium calmly, treating every terrified beast like inventory. He congratulated Ethan for awakening what Apex had searched generations to recreate. To Kane, Nyx was never a companion, only the final missing component. Its void core could stabilize Apex's global extraction network without immediate collapse. Ethan asked what that network would extract, though he already feared the answer. Kane smiled and said every bonded soul currently alive belonged to evolution. Apex had planted hidden resonance towers inside cities, academies, and military zones. Once activated, they would pull through human-beast contracts like hooks through nerves. Tamers would die when companions were stripped away at the soul level. The stolen beast energy would feed Kane enough power to transcend mortality. Nyx mattered because void integration could stabilize billions of incompatible soul signatures. Without a void core, that stolen power would destroy Kane before transformation completed. With Nyx, Kane could turn global extinction into one controlled evolutionary event. Ethan ordered Nyx downward, placing distance between the wyvern and Kane immediately. Kane laughed because he had predicted exactly that protective instinct already. Black pillars erupted from beneath the arena in a circle around Nyx. Each pillar released chains made from pale light rather than elemental energy. Nyx dodged the first two, but 6 more formed behind its wings instantly. One chain wrapped a hind leg and ignored every flame burst against it. Another caught the left wing, while shadow movement failed to cross its boundary. Ethan felt pain through the bond as the chains tightened across Nyx's body. He ordered void absorption, but the void interface returned an unfamiliar failure message. Target structure contains bonded soul resonance. Direct consumption risks companion identity corruption. Kane had built the first true hard counter to void absorption, bonded soul resonance. Ethan immediately ordered Nyx not to touch the chains under any circumstance. The remaining pillars connected overhead, forming a massive translucent soul cage. Nyx slammed against one wall and recoiled as trapped voices screamed inside. Ethan heard those voices through the bond, and nearly lost his balance. The cage had been forged from fragments of beasts Kane already devoured. Every attempt to break it physically forced those trapped remnants to absorb damage. Crow attacked with Eclipse, but Black Claws passed through the soul lattice uselessly. Headmaster Hale summoned a towering storm eagle and struck from above together. Lightning disappeared across the cage while imprisoned beast voices cried louder below. Every powerful tamer nearby tried a different technique and reached the same result. Destroying the soul cage meant destroying whatever remained of its prisoners, too. Kane descended toward the structure while Apex forces secured surrounding platforms nearby. He told Ethan surrender would preserve Nyx's mind during the extraction process. Resistance would force Apex to tear the void core apart while conscious. Ethan ran toward the cage until soldiers blocked the shortest path ahead. Blake and Solarius crashed through them from the side without waiting for thanks. Avery covered Ethan with lightning while Mason raised stone walls behind their route. For the first time, every rivalry and social rank inside Vanguard became irrelevant. They reached the arena center together as Kane began activating the soul cage. Nyx's silver eyes found Ethan through layers of screaming, imprisoned light nearby. The abyssal wyvern stopped struggling when it saw him standing there. Ethan placed one hand against the cage, and agony traveled through his arm. Thousands of broken bond impressions flooded his mind in a single instant. He understood why Nyx refused to absorb them even before receiving orders. Power was available everywhere, but taking it would make Nyx exactly like Kane. Kane smiled, believing compassion had finally created the void beast's weakness. Ethan stared through the cage at the companion everyone once dismissed as trash tier. Then he realized strength had never been the reason Nyx kept surviving. Their next evolution would not begin with hunger, but with something Apex ignored. Kane ordered the soul cage to begin compressing around Nyx's body slowly. Pale walls moved inward, while trapped voices became sharper and more desperate. Ethan felt each cry through his palm pressed against the outer lattice. He pulled away, gasping, but refused to move farther from Nyx. Crow warned that direct contact could permanently damage Ethan's own soul bond. Ethan answered that standing safely outside would not help Nyx survive either. Around them, the strongest tamers attacked Apex positions instead of the cage. They understood brute force would only torture the imprisoned beast remnants inside. Avery joined Ethan and asked whether void absorption could target Kane directly. Ethan explained that Nyx could not escape without consuming bound soul fragments first. Mason stared at the cage and muttered that there had to be another way. Blake remained unusually silent while Solarius guarded the group from corrupted attackers. Cain continued descending, protected by layered spectral beasts orbiting his body. He told Ethan, bonds were simply energy shaped by sentimental human interpretation. Every contract, friendship, and sacrifice could be measured, extracted, and repurposed efficiently. Ethan almost laughed because Cain sounded exactly like Apex Laboratory reports. They understood power perfectly while understanding almost nothing about why beasts chose humans. Inside the cage, Nyx lowered itself as the shrinking walls approached. Wings. Ethan sensed exhaustion, pain, and one emotion he had rarely felt from Nyx. Fear not of dying, but of losing control and hurting trapped souls. That fear told Ethan, the creature still remained entirely itself under pressure. He closed his eyes and reached through the bond without demanding anything. No attack command, absorption order, or evolutionary goal crossed the connection between them. Ethan simply let Nyx feel that he was still standing outside. Memories rose again, but this time, they arrived from both sides together. Ethan remembered the cold ceremony hall and a hatchling clutching his ankle. Nyx remembered warm hands lifting it while strangers discussed throwing it away. Ethan remembered cheap broth warming the first meal inside their broken apartment. Nyx remembered choosing his lap because that was the safest place nearby. Ethan remembered crying beside the heater after every academy rejection arrived. Nyx remembered tasting salt from his cheek and hearing his heartbeat slow. The bond carried those moments with detail no void interface panel could quantify. Neither of them had chosen the other because of rank, bloodline, or power. They chose each other when both had almost nothing anyone else valued. The soul cage reacted as Ethan and Nyx's shared memories deepened together. Crow saw silver oscillations and recognized the resonance pattern he had taught Ethan. Nyx was not overpowering the cage. It was restoring its own signal internally. Cain recognized the danger and increased compression through the command array immediately. More imprisoned voices surged through Ethan when he touched the lattice again. But beneath their pain, he sensed fragments of memory still resisting Cain. A red hawk remembered sleeping beside an elderly tamer during winter journeys. A horned cat remembered protecting a child from rain beneath its body. A river serpent remembered racing beside a fisherman every morning for decades. Cain had consumed their power, but never erased every bond completely. Those remaining signatures still resisted, becoming nothing more than fuel inside him. The cage itself depended on suppressing those identities beneath Cain's dominant frequency. If those bonds remembered themselves, the lattice holding Nyx would destabilize from within. Nyx did not need to devour the souls. It needed them to choose. Ethan pressed both hands against the cage despite Crow's warning behind him. Pain exploded through his body as thousands of impressions rushed inward again. Ethan issued no command. He opened the bond and offered one direction. Remember who you were before Cain turned your bond into fuel. The cage shook violently as several pale chains changed from white to silver. Cain's calm expression finally broke when his control readings started falling. He ordered corrupted beasts to kill Ethan before synchronization progressed any further. Avery stepped in front with Volt, lightning spreading across the broken arena. Mason raised Atlas beside her and formed a wall from shattered platforms. Blake moved to the other side while Solarius's golden mane ignited fully. Crow and Eclipse closed the remaining gap without needing any spoken instruction. For once, Ethan's entire world stood between him and everyone hunting Nyx. He kept both hands against the cage and focused on shared memory. The pressure nearly drove him unconscious, but Nyx answered with steady warmth. Then an older memory surfaced from somewhere Ethan did not immediately recognize. A dim apartment appeared, with Daniel humming beside Ethan after a nightmare. Ethan froze because he had forgotten that melody almost completely until now. His father used to sing it during Ethan's worst childhood winters. The melody carried no magic, but it was one of Ethan's oldest emotional anchors. Through the bond, Nyx recognized safety, fear, and Ethan's heartbeat inside those notes. That familiar pattern synchronized with the resonance Crow had trained them to restore. Ethan began humming despite smoke, alarms, and battle roaring around him. His voice shook badly, yet Nyx lowered its head toward the sound. The melody crossed their bond as memory rather than an audible combat technique. Chains loosened as Nyx's original bond frequency reasserted itself inside the lattice. Avery saw the readings align with Ethan and Nyx's original bond signature. Crow understood first. The lullaby was helping Nyx find itself inside suppression. Once Nyx restored its identity, the trapped souls began remembering theirs too. Ethan continued the lullaby until his throat became raw and breathless. Nyx's silver glow brightened, spreading through every connected soul fragment nearby. Instead of absorbing them, the wyvern returned each memory back through the cage. Pale chains became streams of light searching for their original identities. Cain screamed and tried reclaiming the escaping soul resonance through brute control. The cage walls cracked as imprisoned beasts pulled away from his frequency. A white fracture crossed the ceiling, followed by hundreds more around it. Nyx rose slowly while silver light poured beneath both massive wings. The void interface appeared again, but its text abandoned normal classification. Bond resonance restored. External suppression lattice destabilizing from internal synchronization. Autonomous species genesis detected through stabilized void identity and bonded resonance. Ethan did not understand every word, but one truth was unmistakably clear. Nyx was not becoming stronger by collecting more pieces from other creatures. It was finally becoming the complete form those pieces had helped reveal. The soul cage shattered from inside without destroying a single trapped soul, and the sky above Vanguard turned black beneath Nyx's expanding shadow. Darkness gathered above Nyx, but it did not feel empty anymore. 9 streams of elemental color spiraled outward from the broken soul cage. Each stream carried memories released from Cain's imprisoned beasts moments earlier. Nyx's wings expanded until their shadow covered the entire championship stadium. Its body rose higher as layered scales from like moving black armor. 3 tails became 5, then 7, then 9 behind the growing silhouette. Each tail carried a different elemental glow along its armored edge. Flame burned crimson, frost shone blue, and poison pulsed emerald green. Lightning flashed silver while wind bent smoke around another sweeping tail. Stone hardened one tail into obsidian ridges heavy enough to crack platforms. Shadow consumed light around another, leaving a moving gap in the air. 2 final tails carried energies Ethan could not identify through any scanner. Nyx's face lengthened into something regal rather than merely predatory or draconic. One eye turned brilliant white, while the other deepened into perfect black. The white eye radiated warmth across nearby wounded beasts without harming anyone. The black eye drew loose corruption from the air like distant gravity. Cain backed away despite possessing hundreds of stolen abilities around his armor. The void interface stabilized and finally displayed Nyx's complete new classification. Evolution complete. Void sovereign established. God tier designation confirmed. 6 elemental channels and 3 void spectrum channels stabilized across 9 tails. The power spike smashed through known God tier output limits, triggering automatic regional alerts. Nyx released one roar, and every corrupted beast across the stadium froze. Some collapsed as foreign control energy peeled away from their damaged cores. Others looked around, confused, as though awakening from a shared nightmare. Finally, Ethan stared upward, remembering the hatchling once small enough for one hand. Now, the same silver presence filled half the sky above Vanguard. Yet when Ethan called Nyx, 9 enormous tails moved with familiar excitement. That absurdly recognizable response nearly made him laugh despite everything around them. Cain recovered first and gathered stolen soul power around both extended hands. He accused Ethan of wasting the Void Sovereign on sentimental restraint completely. Then hundreds of spectral beasts erupted outward in a single violent tide. Nyx did not dodge. It opened 9 tails into a wide protective fan. Flame met frost, lightning met wind, and shadow redirected spectral claws sideways. Every stolen ability found an answer among the elements Nyx had integrated. But Ethan quickly realized Cain possessed far more energy than one exchange showed. 2 centuries of consumed companions flowed through him like an endless reservoir. Cain formed a colossal spectral serpent and sent it crashing toward Vanguard. Nyx intercepted above the academy, taking the impact across both wings directly. The collision produced a pressure wave that shattered clouds for kilometers around. Ethan felt pain through the bond, proving God-tier evolution had not erased limits. Nyx pushed the serpent upward, preventing its body from crushing the campus below. Cain laughed and summoned 3 more stolen forms behind the first attack. Crow shouted that fighting every soul individually would exhaust Nyx eventually. Ethan looked at the spectral army and remembered how the cage had broken. Those beasts were not Cain's abilities. They were prisoners still carrying memories. He sent that realization through the bond, and Nyx immediately changed strategy. Instead of destroying the next spectral wolf, Nyx wrapped it in white light. The creature stopped attacking as images flickered across its transparent body slowly. A young girl feeding it beside a river, appeared within the ghostly shape. The wolf turned away from Nyx and faced Cain for the first time. Cain's expression, twisted as one stolen soul, resisted his commands completely. Nyx released another pulse of white light across the entire spectral battlefield. Memories awakened one by one inside creatures Cain treated as ammunition. A hawk remembered freedom, bear remembered family, and serpents remembered partners. Chains hidden inside their spectral bodies became visible under the white illumination. Nyx's black eye pulled only those chains, leaving every soul untouched behind. Cain screamed as hundreds of stolen connections tore free from his armor. Cain's preserved youthful appearance collapsed as stolen life energy escaped him. Hair turned white, skin thinned, and centuries returned across his face together. He desperately gathered remaining power into one sphere above his shaking hands. The sphere contained fire, plague, lightning, frost, and screaming shadow energy. Ethan knew the attack would destroy Vanguard even if Nyx survived impact. He ordered every ally to evacuate the central stadium as quickly as possible. Blake tried remaining behind until Solarius physically pushed him toward safety barriers. Avery and Mason followed, while Crow stayed beside Ethan despite evacuation orders. Cain released the sphere downward with enough force to bend surrounding light. Nyx opened its black eye fully and created a familiar point of darkness. Void singularity appeared again, but this time, the technique remained perfectly stable. The incoming sphere curved, stretched, and vanished inside the controlled darkness completely. Cain stared in horror as his ultimate attack got completely neutralized without exploding. Nyx then expanded the singularity behind him instead of directly beneath his body. Ethan understood immediately that Nyx was creating containment rather than destruction. Now, Cain summoned chains, wings, and barriers from the few remaining stolen souls. Released beasts tore those defenses apart before they could fully stabilize around him. Crow's eclipse struck first, severing one spectral anchor from Cain's shoulder. Solarius returned next, burning another anchor despite Blake's exhausted condition nearby. Volt shattered a third with lightning, while Atlas broke the final ground seal. Cain was suddenly alone, stripped of every bond he had stolen for centuries. Nyx lowered one massive claw and pinned him without crushing his fragile body. The void singularity widened into a silent doorway behind the defeated tamer. Ethan asked where it led, and the void interface displayed isolated spatial containment. No living ecosystem existed there for Cain to consume or manipulate further. Nyx released him only after every remaining stolen soul moved safely away. Cain fell backward into the darkness while shouting that Apex would continue. The doorway closed before his final threat could become another command or attack. Silence followed, broken only by freed beasts returning as fading lights above. Nyx remained in the sky while the last corrupted energy vanished from Vanguard. The battle ended not because the Void Sovereign devoured everything before it. It ended because Nyx finally learned exactly what should never be consumed. For several seconds, nobody inside the ruined stadium seemed capable of moving. Then cheers rose from evacuation corridors, rooftops, bridges, and surviving arena sections. Ethan barely heard them, because exhaustion finally reached every part of his body. He sank onto broken stone, while Nyx descended slowly from the darkened sky. The Void Sovereign landed carefully, folding wings that could cover entire buildings. 9 tails settled around the arena like enormous elemental banners after battle. Ethan stood again, only because he wanted to reach Nyx before medics arrived. One massive white black eye lowered until it rested level with him. Ethan placed both hands against familiar scales and started laughing from relief. Nyx answered with the same low rumbling sound from their first night. For one impossible moment, the god-tier beast felt small enough to hold again. Avery reached them first, bruised, limping, and covered in dust everywhere. She looked from Ethan to Nyx and shook her head with exhausted disbelief. Mason arrived behind her, carrying Atlas, despite the golem being much heavier. He insisted the entire situation had become officially too complicated for school. Even Ethan laughed at that, while medical teams spread across the stadium. Blake approached later, with Solarius walking slowly beside his bandaged shoulder. The confidence he once wore like armor had disappeared somewhere during battle. He stopped several steps away and struggled visibly with what came next. Then Blake lowered his head and apologized for everything since their ceremony. He admitted Ethan's weakest-looking companion had shown more control than most champions. Ethan accepted the apology without pretending. Years of humiliation vanished instantly. Blake nodded, apparently understanding. Forgiveness and friendship were different things entirely. He still offered cooperation against whatever remained of Apex outside Vanguard. Ethan agreed that stopping Apex mattered more than continuing an old-school rivalry. Solarius approached Nyx cautiously and lowered its golden head in respect. Nyx returned the gesture without dominance, aggression, or any visible challenge. Across the world, similar reactions appeared among bonded beasts watching broadcast footage. Some lowered their heads when the Void Sovereign crossed replay screens above cities. Others became strangely calm whenever Nyx's final roar played through public speakers. Researchers would argue about that phenomenon for years without reaching one conclusion. Vanguard suspended the championship and converted every facility into recovery operations temporarily. Apex laboratories were raided across multiple countries using evidence recovered from Shaw. Several captured researchers confirmed resonance towers had already been installed worldwide secretly. Kane's defeat prevented activation, but removing every tower required years of work. Crow accepted a temporary council position focused on protecting recovered experimental beasts. Eclipse became strangely fond of Nyx. Despite pretending to ignore the younger creature, Ethan moved back into his dorm after officials declared the tower safe again. The room suddenly looked absurdly small beside Nyx's new god-tier body outside. So Nyx rested outside the dorm tower beneath reinforced academy shielding. Ethan simply spent more evenings outdoors beside the beast he had raised. Ethan was relieved because campus housing definitely did not cover roof reconstruction. Weeks passed before either of them returned to anything resembling ordinary classes. Students no longer laughed when Ethan entered training halls with Nyx beside him. Some stared with admiration, others with fear, and many simply moved aside. Ethan disliked all three reactions when they forgot Nyx was still Nyx. So he kept the same routines that existed before anyone knew their potential. Morning training, shared meals, medical checks, and quiet walks beyond crowded courtyards. Nyx still stole roasted meat whenever Ethan looked away for several seconds. It still hated bitter medicine, and pretended not to hear recall commands afterward. Power had transformed everything around them without changing those familiar details. One evening, Crow returned Ethan's father's journal from secure evidence storage personally. Technicians had discovered a hidden compartment beneath the damaged back cover earlier. Inside rested one folded page, written in Daniel Cole's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the message beside Nyx near sunset. The first lines explained that Daniel expected Apex to eventually find the journal. He had hidden his final warning where ordinary searches would likely miss it. The message confirmed Void Sovereign was never meant to be the journey's end. According to ancient records, the form functioned as something called the key. Ethan read the final sentence twice, before speaking it aloud to Crow. The Void Sovereign is not the end. It is the key. And the door, his father wrote, has already begun to open. Nyx raised its head toward the distant mountains beyond Vanguard Academy. Every beast across the courtyard became silent at exactly the same moment. Far beyond the horizon, something enormous released a roar beneath the earth. The sound was deeper than Nyx's, older than anything Ethan had heard. Crow's face lost every trace of relief as Eclipse stepped forward defensively. Ethan closed the journal and rested one hand against Nyx's scaled neck. Their first evolution changed their lives. Now, the real mystery had finally awakened.